Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're coming back with the second part of our research methods lecture. Now today we're going to talk about a quantitative form of research that sociologists do quite a bit, and that is the survey. Everyone here, I guarantee, has filled out a survey at some point in their lives. In fact, you'll get a quantitative survey as part of this class. You'll be asked to rate Dr. Maples on a scale of whatever they decide as to how well I've done across different ways of teaching this class. It's exciting. You'll also get that for all sorts of other professors. Now, with surveys, these are quantitative because we can often count things. Now, in a perfect world, I want to note that they can also include qualitative stuff where we ask people to respond in their own words. But for simplicity's sake, we're going to think about, for this lecture, surveys in a quantitative approach. All right, that said, whenever we're thinking about numbers, we need to make sure that we are representing where those numbers come from. Let me give you a good example. Let's pretend that as a surveyor, I need to understand how Kentucky residents feel about a particular issue. Now, let's pretend that I decide for my survey of how Kentucky residents feel, that I decide to collect data from East Tennesseans and ask them how Kentucky residents feel about that particular issue. Now, are East Tennesseans, did you hear my accent come out there? Are East Tennesseans a good example of how Kentuckians feel? Not at all. Let's start that study again. In fact, let's get specific. I'm going to do a survey finding out how Kentuckians feel about holding the Kentucky Derby during quarantine. And to collect data for this particular survey, I'm going to exclusively ask people in the state of Kentucky who I know for a fact hate horse racing. Now, will that give me a representative feeling of how all Kentuckians feel, or just people who hate horse racing? Let's see, there was a problem again. What if I wanted to understand how Kentuckians feel about holding the Kentucky Derby during quarantine, and I only ask EKU college students? Are EKU college students representative of all Kentuckians? No, probably not at all. This is where we get into an issue that whenever we do a survey, we first need to declare something we call our population. Now, a population is the group of people that we propose our survey is going to study. Now, surveys ask questions, and we want to make sure that the people answering those questions represent the people we're going to study. Likewise, we realize that in pretty much all cases, we probably can't ask every person in our population those questions. Kentucky has like 3-point-something million people, as I recall, just off the top of my head. That's a lot of people. There's no possible way, no matter how many resources I had, that I could interview, or rather survey, every Kentucky resident. It's just not possible. Likewise, on any given moment, there's people living and dying, being born, moving in, moving out of Kentucky, so the number's changing every day. Other people live here, but maybe they're going to be away for the next 6 months. I can't survey everyone, but I can survey a chunk of them. In fact, we call that a sample. A sample is a sliver of our population that we feel represents the entire population. Sampling and populations are very easy when we think about pizza, something that we all love. I really love pizza. Fortunately, we have some good pizza in Richmond and in Berea. Now, with pizza, think about ordering a cheese pizza, just a plain cheese pizza. We'll make it a 14-inch plain cheese pizza. Now, if I ate the whole pizza, I could tell you for certain that was, in fact, a cheese pizza. And I have eaten a whole pizza before, so just be aware. If we're ever around pizza and I'm hungry, I'll eat the whole pizza. I don't care. And you're like, I'll fight you for it. Okay, fair enough. But I could also, instead of eating the whole pizza and telling you that's a cheese pizza, I could also grab one slice out of that pizza. I could eat that slice and I'd be like, yeah, that's a cheese pizza. That's what sampling is. I can eat one piece of a pizza and tell you what kind of pizza I'm eating. Sampling is the same way when we're doing this with a survey. If I want to represent all Kentuckians, I need something that's a nice representative sample of all Kentuckians. So maybe I go through with the resources that I have and I find, 50 addresses of people living in each county in Kentucky, and I send them surveys. That might be far more representative of the whole Kentucky response to a survey rather than just focusing on something easy like EKU students. Now, an example here would also be like, let's pretend I want to do a study on EKU parking policy for students. And I want to understand how students feel about EKU's parking dilemma. We basically never have enough spaces where we need to have them. To do that survey, all I would need to do is select a portion of EKU students and have them fill out that survey. And more or less, I can guarantee that the results are going to show how all EKU students feel. That's how populations and samples work. If you line up your population, you line up your sample, it starts your survey off on a great footing. Now, another thing that surveys do, they can ask all sorts of questions. Have you done this? Have you done that? How many times have you done this particular activity? But we can also get into your brain. Exciting, right? Sociologists are really good at measuring emotions. In fact, we have something called the Likert item. By the way, you'll occasionally hear these called Likert items, which I understand is actually correct, that they are Likert items. But when I call them Likert items at sociology events, people have for so long called them Likert items, they think that's the correct thing and they correct me, and then I have to go through this whole explanation and it's just not worth it anymore. So I've just given up and I call them Likert items too. Likert items measure emotions, and I guarantee you've seen one of these before. Think about a survey that you receive that asks you how you feel about something. They would give you a statement. There is plenty of parking at EKU, and they would ask you to strongly agree, to strongly disagree with that statement. That's a Likert item. That's exactly what that's doing. Now, let's pretend that you say you strongly disagree with something. Well, when we get into the data analysis and we're quantifying, because it's a quantitative study, how you feel about something, we might give strongly disagree a 1. And if you said you strongly agree with the statement, we might give that a 5. And now I can take all the responses from all the people who said they strongly agree to strongly disagree about something and find out about what the average or mean score would be. So 4.5 might be the final mean, and that would mean that overall people agree that there's not enough parking at EKU. That might be a good example of that. Because there's not. There's not enough student parking. And in fact, sometimes they take student parking and give it to faculty. So I don't have any trouble finding parking most semesters. Usually the first 2 weeks, it's a little crazy, but beyond that, it's normal. So with Likert items, they're really good about capturing your emotions. Now, we also have all sorts of other survey questions where we ask about things you have done or haven't done. And we can build surveys to collect any amount of information that we need to answer a particular question that we might have. Surveys are not just built on questions, however. Within every survey you've ever taken that was well designed, each question is measuring a particular variable. Variables are a very important and very exciting way of how sociologists work with the scientific method in our research methods. Now, for us, variables represent a particular attribute that can vary from one case to another. I could do a survey finding out the average age of my class, and I could simply ask you, what is your age in years? And you would put in a number, and I would go through and I would add all those numbers up, and then I would divide them by the number of students. Well, bam, now I have a variable that is telling me average age. That's exciting. Now, for every variable that we have in a study, we do take a moment to define how we are thinking of this variable and also how we're going to measure this variable. And this is because in the scientific method, we need to make sure that everybody understands how we're creating this new knowledge. We're not just making these ideas up. Often, in fact, when we create variables, we're using the same way that others have approached the variable. Let's use that age variable again. So the common way of using age is to ask the age in years. Other people might say, well, let's ask about how many days old they are, but people don't know that. Or maybe they try to say years and days, and frankly, I'm not sure that I could do that math off the top of my head. So the common way that other people have measured age is to say, how old are you in years? That's a good example of how we would define our variable of age. In fact, when we define a variable, that's what we call conceptualizing the variable. We give meaning to the concept. You see how the word concept is in there? So when we define a variable, we're giving a meaning to the concept. We're telling everyone exactly what we mean by this variable. So 300 years later, when someone's looking at that data set, which hopefully they can still open Excel files back then in the future, they would look back and they'd be able to see in my notes that I defined age as how old you were in years. And they'd be like, okay, we get that idea. We also include an explanation of how we're going to measure something. That's what we call operationalizing. We're putting the measurement into action with this definition. So not only are we defining the idea, but now we're explaining how we're going to measure it. A lot of times these overlap. In fact, if I'm explaining age, I'm going to measure it as the numeric value of how many years they are old. That's it. So it gets a little funny that the two overlap. Now, if we think about variables like Likert items, we could see that we conceptualize something as strongly agreeing or strongly disagreeing with a particular statement. And then operationalizing it would be that we turned their responses into numbers. If they strongly disagreed, we made it a 1. If they said they were neutral, we made it a 3. And if they strongly agreed, we made it a 5. That would be conceptualizing and operationalizing. Let's give you another example of that. Let's talk about a really common variable that demographers are a kind of sociologists that study birth, death, and the movement of people from place to place. Let's talk about a variable that they use a lot, infant mortality. For demographers, who are a kind of sociologists, they would conceptualize infant mortality, or define it, as being the number of infants dying in their first year of life after birth. And they would be very specific. An infant mortality case would be from the very moment that you were born to the completion of the first year of your life. If you die in that range from the moment you're born right up to the moment that you're 1 year old, you would be counted as a case of infant mortality. Before that, you're not infant mortality, you're something else. You're an infant who has died before birth, and after the age of 1, you're just a child death. You're not an infant death anymore. So that's an important conceptualization. They have defined what they mean. And now, because of the scientific method, everybody can go, okay, I understand what they mean. I understand how they're measuring or how they're defining this idea. And we can all agree on any knowledge that they create from this variable. Operationalizing it would also be how they measure an idea. So a demographer would say, we measure the infant mortality rate as the exact number of infant deaths in our population. Or let me rephrase that. We measure infant mortality as the exact number of infant deaths in our population, and the infant mortality rate would be the number of infant deaths per 1,000 residents in an area. That would be a good example. Actually, you know what? Let me go back in time. I think infant mortality is infant deaths for every 1,000 live births. I take that back. I'm not a demographer. I was trained by some demographers, but I'm not a demographer. Point being is that we always make sure we're very explicit about how we measure ideas. It's very important that everybody knows what we're working with. And because of this helps sociologists make really useful knowledge contributions that can be trusted by the scientific community and that can be vetted as being true. Now, surveys are just one way that we collect data. In fact, what I want to do is call our lecture here, and in our next lecture, we're going to talk about a more qualitative approach, and that's what we call ethnography or observation, or as I call it, people watching, which is what sociologists do. If you like people watching, you'll enjoy this next one. Also, I'll tell you a really cool story about an ethnographer who with ties to the University of Tennessee, where I'm from. So anyways, if you have questions, you know where to find me. Otherwise, I will see you in our next lecture. Take care.